Thank you, Chair. I move the amendment. I speak.
Yep.
This amendment, although it's very simple, I think it speaks to the foundational issues with the government's approach to this legislation. It currently states that an intervention may be established. That's the legislative language for might. It's an option if there's the political will and if there's the public pressure. Instead, the bill, as I'm proposing, would compel the government to establish an intervention when the criteria is met. There should be no doubt, no ambiguity that this is the standard of transitional justice and that the language should be shall act. After all we know about these institutions, about Tuam and other potential sites, about the abuse and the neglect, and this bill says the government might act, not that they should, is just kind of unbelievable. There is no appreciation for what that type of language says to survivors and relatives. All witnesses called for robust legislation that would ensure timely interventions. Saying may instead of shall undermines everything they have said. Minister, if you ring true to your stated commitment in this area, then please accept this amendment.
Thanks, Deputy Minister. Do you want to respond?
Thanks, Chair. Well, we are bringing forward robust legislation, and we've gone through a detailed process, and we've strengthened it, and we've listened and made changes along the way to try and strengthen this legislation. And we'll be indicating as this session goes on further changes that we will be making to ensure that this legislation is as robust as possible, to ensure that it can create a process that can bring some relief, some succour to relatives like the relatives in Tuam. But in terms of this specific amendment, basically what it is proposing is that the legislation will direct Cabinet to do something. It takes away any discretion from Cabinet, which I'm not sure if actually legislation can constrain the decision-making power of the executive in that way. And it's basically saying as soon as the Minister bring forward a proposal, Cabinet must approve it, and that you can't have legislation that directs Cabinet to take a particular decision on an issue. So I'm not in the position to accept this particular amendment.
Deputy Carnes?
Just to say, like, when you're speaking about it, you use words there like ensure, but then when it comes to the bill, you'll just put in may and not shall. And like, it's not reasonable to say, oh, we can't use that kind of language in a bill. Like, we often see that kind of language in a bill in relation to anything to do with Cabinet. It's not unusual to have shall rather than may in our legislation.
Minister?
Whereas some legislative provisions, of course, do have shall. I'm not aware of any where shall is used in terms of directing the Cabinet to do something. And in terms of this specific recommendation, you're saying subject to subsection 2, it currently says the government may, from time to time, having considered a proposal made by a relevant minister, you're saying shall. So again, you're removing the discretion of the Cabinet in terms of a proposal that's being made. And again, that is the legislation trying to bind the executive, another arm of the state, and I'd have severe questions in terms of whether that's actually constitutional in terms of the separation of powers.
Just a final word, and I suppose given that, like, we all know that already the coroner was obliged to act, the coroner is obliged to act when somebody dies in state care or custody, or when there's remains found in their district. The guards are obliged to act when there's a missing person, and nobody's ever acted on these sites. And now it has to be at the discretion that a government might act. It's just added to the long list of inaction. That's how people are going to feel.
I suppose I'd make the point that this government has acted, and it's acted to bring forward this piece of legislation, and
that
it's
it might
engaged.
act in some situations where there's manifestly inappropriate burials and somebody was ordinarily a resident in a home. There's so many restrictions, limitations on top of limitations, that nobody's obliged to act on anything.
If I can just conclude the point, this government has acted. It's acted by bringing forward this legislation. It's acted by making a very clear commitment that it will undertake the investigation in Tuam, and it has brought forward in this year's budget very significant allocation to my department so we can begin that work. So that money is available now, not looking to get it in budget 2023, but that money is available to begin the work as soon as this legislation is passed. So I think that combination demonstrates the determination of this government, my determination of Minister, to make sure we do act on what's happened in Tuam.
Okay, so on amendment number 10, which has already been moved, How stands the amendment? Is the amendment being withdrawn or pressed?
Pressed.
On amendment number 10, the question is that the amendment be made. Those in favour say Tá.
Tá.
Those against say Neil. I think the question is lost.
Vote all.
Vote all. Is amendment 10, that the amendment be made, and on that question a division has been challenged, so the division will now be taken by the clerk.
Minister. Deputy Backage.
Tá.
Deputy Cairns.
Tá.
Deputy Costello.
Neil.
Deputy Crowe.
Neil.
Deputy Alan Dillon.
Neil.
Deputy Function.
Tá.
And Deputy Cormac Devlin, substituting for Jennifer Manane O'Connor. Deputy John Paul Phelan. And Deputy Ward.
Oh.
Okay, so the result of the division is Tá 4, Neil 6, and the question is lost.